The voice came through the static, like a ghost, thin and frayed at the edges. A voice stripped of authority, left with only the grit of resignation. Command, this is Ares 1. The objective is lost. I say again, objective is lost. We are compromised at the Serafina Dam. Requesting immediate, the transmission fractured, swallowed by a burst of noise that sounded like tearing metal. A moment of dead air, then the voice returned colder. It's too late, Ares 1 out. Inside the cockpit of callsign Valkyrie 1-1, Major Evelyn Reed felt the words more than she heard them. They settled deep in her bones, a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. Below her, the Viridian landscape was a tapestry of impenetrable black, a world asleep and indifferent. Her world, however, was the emerald green glow of the heads-up display, a lattice of numbers and symbols projected onto the armored glass between her and the abyss. Altitude 20,000 feet. Airspeed 350 knots. Time on station 73 ni. 3 minutes remaining. Her hands gloved in gray. Nomex rested on the stick and throttle with the placid stillness of a seasoned professional. They did not tremble. They did not react. They simply were extensions of a will that had been forged over 2 decades of service in conflicts whose names were already fading from headlines into history books. A new voice, crisp and clear, filled her helmet. The voice of command, insulated by distance and procedure. Valkyrie 1-1, you copy that last transmission from Trident. Evelyn's thumb depressed the transmit button on the throttle. Her voice was level, almost unnervingly calm, a voice that conceded nothing. Valkyrie copies. Ares 1 reports, objective lost. Affirmative, command replied. The word was sterile. The ground element is compromised. Their extraction is not viable at this time. Your mission is terminated. You are to disengage immediately. Return to base. Acknowledge. Return to base. The 2 most common words in a pilot's vocabulary, yet tonight, they sounded alien, profane. Evelyn's gaze drifted from the glowing emerald data to the darkness beyond. The Serafina Dam wasn't just a pin on a digital map for her. For the past 2 weeks, she had studied it, memorized its contours, the deep gorge it straddled, the winding access roads carved into the mountainside. She knew it better than the layout of her own assigned quarters back at the airbase. She knew the blind spots. She knew the shadows where an enemy could hide and where a hunter could strike from. Her fingers moved with quiet deliberation across a console to her right, calling up the feed from the littening TGP pod, slung beneath her A-10's fuselage. The world of abstract green symbols collapsed into a grainy, high-contrast image. The thermal view. White-hot signatures, small constellations of human heat, clustered behind the concrete retaining walls of the dam's western abutment. The seals. Trident. Then she panned the camera, her thumb guiding the crosshairs with surgical precision, moving up the ridge that overlooked their position. And there they were. Not one cluster of enemy heat, but 3, 4. A pincer movement flowing down the slopes like fingers closing into a fist. The seals hadn't just been compromised. They had been herded into a kill box. Command couldn't see this. Their satellite imagery was minutes old. Their intelligence was based on a plan that had evaporated on contact with reality. But she could see it. She was the eye in the sky, the only one who saw the geometry of the coming slaughter. Her gaze flickered to the top right corner of her canopy frame. Taped there, held by strips of yellowed brittle adhesive, was a photograph. A young man with her same gray eyes and a smile too wide for his face, his uniform crisp and new. Her brother Daniel. Lost on a dusty ridge 20 years ago, in a different war, in a different lifetime. Lost after command had called off air support, deeming the risk too high for a situation already considered lost. "It's too late." The phrase echoed not from the radio, but from the hollow chamber of her memory. The same words. The same verdict delivered by a calm, distant voice. She looked back at the thermal feed. The white-hot signatures of the enemy were creeping closer. The SEALs were holding their fire-conserving ammunition, unaware of the net tightening around them. They were the best of the best, but they were blind. And they were about to die. The voice from command crackled again, impatient this time. "Valkyrie 1-1, do you acknowledge the order to return to base?" Evelyn Reed took a slow, deep breath. The recycled air of the cockpit tasted of ozone and regret. She could follow the order. She could climb to a safe altitude, turn her formidable war machine towards home, and live to fly another day. It would be the correct, professional, and survivable thing to do. Her report would note that she had obeyed protocol. No one would blame her. No one but herself. Her thumb moved from the radio switch to another lower on the stick. It was a small, guarded button encased in a red metal ring. The master arm switch. She flicked its cover up. The switch beneath was a dull, unassuming black. She keyed the transmitter again. Her voice, when it came, was just as calm as before, but it carried a weight that defied 20,000 feet of empty air. It was the sound of a decision from which there was no return. Command, negative. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a severed line of a rule broken, of a lone pilot choosing to fly into the storm rather than away from it. Below her, the A-10 Thunderbolt seconds and the Warthog dipped its nose towards the dark, unseen earth and began its descent. The silence that answered her defiance was a world away from the noise of the flight line 6 hours earlier. Before the sun had breached the horizon, the air at Al-Tariq Air Base was already thick with the smells of burnt kerosene and hot dust. The pre-dawn cool was a fleeting memory banished by the thermal mass of the concrete tarmac. It was a place of controlled chaos, of APU whines, and the clatter of maintenance carts. But for Evelyn Reed, it was a sanctuary. This was where she communed with her machine. She was performing her pre-flight walk-around, a ritual she conducted with the meticulousness of a priestess. Her A-10 tail number 780615 sat squat and menacing under the floodlights, an ugly, honest brute of an aircraft. It was not designed for elegance or speed. It was designed to survive. Its skin was a patchwork of scarred panels and rivet lines, each one a testament to a long, hard life. To the younger pilots zipping past in their sleek gray F-16s, it was a museum piece. To Evelyn, it was the only thing that had never lied to her. Her gloved fingers traced the leading edge of the wing, feeling for imperfections. She ran her hand over the massive fan blades of the twin turbofan engines, mounted high on the fuselage like a monstrous backpack. Her movements were slow, deliberate, unhurried. "Look at her." A voice cut through the morning air. Lieutenant Jake Raptor Mitchell, all youthful confidence and swagger, gestured with his chin towards Evelyn. He and his wingman, Lieutenant Simon Viper Ross, were leaning against a supply crate, sipping coffee from paper cups. "She checks that thing like she's expecting it to fall apart on the taxiway." "It probably is." Viper chuckled. "Thing's older than my dad. Why do they even keep these warthogs flying? Because nothing else can do what they do." Raptor conceded, though his tone was dismissive. "Still. Major Reed. She's a relic flying a relic, all by the book. Never seen her crack a joke, never seen her hurry. It's like she's permanently flying at half speed." Their eyes were on her, but Evelyn didn't notice or didn't care. Her attention was absolute, focused on the 7-barreled Gatling gun that formed the entire nose of the aircraft. The GAU-8 Avenger. a cannon so large the plane had been built around it. She crouched, checking the integrity of the drum-fed ammunition system, her gaze sweeping over the access panels. The ground crew had already signed off on it, but she always checked for herself. Trust in her line of work was earned one rivet at a time. She stood up, her back straight, and her eyes briefly scanned the flight line. The lieutenants were watching her. She offered no reaction, her face a neutral mask. They saw a woman in her 40s, her flight suit immaculate but worn at the cuffs and collar. They saw the faint lines around her eyes, mistaking weariness for weakness. They couldn't see the faintest whisper of a white scar that traced the line of her jaw, mostly hidden by her collar. They didn't know it was a souvenir from a low-altitude ejection over a forgotten jungle. They saw a quiet major, a placeholder in the squadron roster, counting the days to a quiet retirement. They did not see a warrior. They saw a woman who was past her time. Her pre-flight complete, Evelyn climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The space was cramped, functional, a titanium bathtub, designed to protect the pilot from ground fire. There was no sleek glass display, only a collection of steam gauges and smaller multifunction screens. It smelled of worn leather and ozone. Home. Before strapping in, she reached out and gently touched the corner of the photograph of Daniel. A silent promise made every time she flew. She sealed the canopy, and the noise of the flight line dimmed to a muffled hum. The world outside vanished, replaced by the intimate reality of her instruments. She was no longer Major Reed, the quiet relic. She was Valkyrie 1-to-1. Here alone with the beast, she was whole. Here the silence was not empty. It was filled with potential. Raptor's words echoed faintly in her memory as she taxied towards the runway. Too slow for this war. Slow, Evelyn thought now as gravity clawed at her flight suit, pulling her deeper into her seat. The black and green world of the Viridian Gorge rushed up to meet her, the canyon walls a claustrophobic blur on either side of her canopy. The A-10, a machine derided for its lack of speed, was now in its element, a predator using the terrain as its hunting ground. Slow is a matter of perspective. She was no longer the quiet officer from the flight line. She was the descending angel of vengeance the enemy had not accounted for. She had seen their trap from above, and in the silent, solitary space of her cockpit, she had passed her own judgment. Her thumb rested on the firing trigger for the cannon. The men on the ground had given up hope. Command had washed its hands of them. They had been left behind by a world that moved too fast. But Evelyn Reed was old school, and she was coming for them. The world narrowed to the width of the canyon. Rock walls, ancient and unforgiving, screamed past her canopy so close she could see the stratification of the stone. The A-10 bucked and shuddered in the turbulent air, a beast wrestling with the very earth it was designed to hunt over. Gravity pressed Evelyn into her seat, a physical reminder of the commitment she had made. In moments like this, there was no past, no future. There was only the next 100 feet of sky, the next adjustment of the stick, the next calculation of airspeed versus angle of attack. This absolute focus was a familiar state. It was the violent kinetic counterpart to the profound stillness she cultivated on the ground. The stillness of her assigned quarters. Her room at Al-Tariq was a testament to a life lived in transit, a monk's cell with a military serial number. The bed was always made with geometric precision. The single uniform hanging in the open closet was perfectly pressed. There were no posters, no souvenirs, no personal touches to soften the institutional beige of the walls. It was a room designed to be forgotten, a temporary shelter for a soul that was never truly at rest. Any officer inspecting it would see only perfect, impersonal order. They would not see the small, dark wood box on the nightstand. It was an old cigar box, its varnish worn smooth by the touch of her hands over countless nights in countless identical rooms. It was the only part of her life that was not government issue. Inside, cushioned by faded black velvet, lay the artifacts of her true identity. There was the photo of Daniel, his smile a permanent fixture of a summer long past. Beside it lay a squadron patch, its threadbare embroidery depicting a skeletal rider on a winged horse against a black field. The Ghost Riders. A name that meant nothing, now a whisper from a dead conflict. There was also a single heavy brass shell casing from a 30mm round, polished to a dull gleam. A memento from her first combat mission. And beneath it all, a letter. Daniel's last one sent from a forward operating base, whose name was now just a dot on an old map. She didn't need to read the words anymore. They were etched into her memory. She could feel the cheap, thin paper see his hurried scrawl. The memory associated with it was not of grief, but of a promise. It came to her unbidden in the quiet hours before a mission, a scene playing out with perfect clarity. A crackling video call, his face pixelated, and young framed by the desert camouflage of his tent. He was trying to be brave, the tough infantryman talking to his pilot sister. It's different on the ground, Ev, he'd said, the audio lagging half a second behind the image. Up there you see everything. Down here, you just see the next patch of dirt. The guy next to you. You have to trust that someone somewhere is watching your back. That's my job, Danny, she had replied, trying to keep her voice light. To be the ugliest guardian angel in the sky. He'd laughed a burst of static and joy. Yeah, well, just promise me. If you're ever up there and some guys like me are down here, you be that angel. No matter what the guys in the fancy chairs tell you, you be the one. Promise me. She had promised. It had seemed like an easy thing to promise a younger brother a reassurance offered across thousands of miles. But after he was gone, after the official reports and the folded flag, the promise had changed. It had crystallized. It was no longer a comfort. It was a creed. It was the core of the solitude she now wrapped around herself. The other pilots saw a quiet, distant major. They didn't see a woman standing a perpetual watch guarding a promise made to a ghost. Her isolation was not a weakness. It was the fortress where she kept that promise safe. A burst of red tracers from the canyon rim ahead snapped her back to the present. They stitched a fiery line across the sky, harmlessly high above her. A blind, panicked volley from an enemy that could hear her, but couldn't see her yet. On the secure frequency, she had opened the voice of the SEAL commander. Ares 1 crackled with a mixture of confusion and fury. Unknown aircraft in the Serafina Gorge, you are in a contested kill zone. Who the hell is this? Identify yourself, damn it. Evelyn ignored him. She was not here to talk. Talking was for the men in the fancy chairs. She was here to fulfill a promise. Her eyes scanned the thermal display. The pincer movement she had seen from 20,000 feet was now terrifyingly close. A team of 3 enemy combatants, armed with what looked like an RPG, was creeping along a ledge directly above the SEAL's position. They were the most immediate threat. Her promise to Daniel, her years of solitude, her methodical obsession, it all coalesced into a single pure point of action. She was not Major Reed, the relic. She was not Evelyn, the grieving sister. She was Valkyrie, the instrument of a promise. Her left thumb nudged the coolie hat switch on her throttle, slewing the targeting pod's crosshairs. They settled over the 3 white-hot figures on the ledge. A small green box locked around them. The heads-up display confirmed the lock. Range 1, 800 meters. Her right thumb tightened on the red 2-stage trigger on the control stick. The first stage activated the firing computer. The second would unleash the Avenger. Ares One's voice screamed in her ear. "Pull up, for God's sake. Pull up, you're gonna fly into the dam." But she wasn't looking at the dam. She was looking through a cannon's gun sight, and she had a promise to keep. The green targeting box on Evelyn's heads-up display was a cage of perfect digital lines holding the 3 enemy soldiers on the ledge. It was clean, certain, a cold mathematical promise of destruction. It was as clean and certain as the lines on the satellite maps they had shown in the briefing room 2 days ago. The memory materialized sharp and unwelcome, an overlay on the chaos of the canyon run. The briefing room had been chilled to an unnatural coldness, the air scrubbed clean and sterile. On the main screen, a high-resolution image of the Serafina Dam was displayed, a jewel of strategic importance in a hostile landscape. Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man whose ambition was sharper than the creases on his uniform, commanded the room with a PowerPoint presentation and an unshakable belief in modern warfare. "The plan is straightforward. Ladies and gentlemen," Thorne had announced, his laser pointer circling the dam. "Trident team will insert via halo jump. At 0200 secure the primary turbine hall and plant charges on the generator couplings. Air support," he clicked to the next slide, showing the flight paths of 2 F-16s, "will be on station at 25,000 feet, ready to neutralize any armored response with satellite-guided munitions. It will be a surgical strike." He spoke of the dam not as a place of rock and concrete, but as a series of data points. He spoke of the enemy as icons on a screen. Evelyn, seated near the back, as always remained silent, her eyes tracing the deep, shadowed scar of the gorge on the map. It was a feature the satellite imagery flattened, a detail the algorithmic flight plans avoided. When Thorne opened the floor for questions, the silence was deferential. The plan was clean. It was safe. It minimized risk to expensive assets. It was the kind of plan that earned promotions. Then Evelyn spoke. Her voice, quiet but clear, cut through the conditioned air. "Colonel, your plan overlooks the thermal and signal dead zones within the canyon itself. The enemy has been operating in this region for years. They know that gorge is a perfect staging area, invisible from high altitude." Thorne's smile was patient, the kind one gives a child who has asked a naive question. "Major Reed, we have constant drone overwatch and satellite feeds. If there's a vehicle down there, we'll see it. You won't see men on foot." Colonel Evelyn insisted, her gaze unwavering. "Not if they know how to hide. They can use the rock formations to mask their heat signatures and the canyon walls to block radio signals. Trident could be walking into an ambush less than a click from their objective, and we would never know until it was too late. I recommend a low-level reconnaissance pass, or if they are engaged, a direct close air support run. Through the gorge." A low murmur went through the room. Lieutenants Raptor and Viper exchanged a barely perceptible smirk. A flight through the Serafina Gorge in an A-10 was considered suicidal. Colonel Thorne's smile tightened. "With all due respect, Major, your approach is a textbook solution from a bygone era. We are engaged in network-centric warfare now. We leverage technology to mitigate risk. We do not send a multi-million-dollar asset and its pilot on a low-level strafing run based on a hunch." He made the word sound unprofessional, emotional. He saw her experience not as an asset, but as a liability, an attachment to an outdated way of fighting. The Serafina Dam to him was a problem to be solved with algorithms. To Evelyn, it was a terrain to be respected, a death trap waiting for the arrogant. "The plan is set." Thorne had concluded, his tone leaving no room for further discussion. He had looked directly at her. "Your role, Major, is to provide high-altitude overwatch and stay out of the way. Is that clear?" "Crystal, Colonel," she had replied. The memory of his condescending certainty of the smirks from the younger pilots of a world so sure of its technology that it had forgotten the wisdom of the human eye evaporated in a sudden violent shudder. Her thumb squeezed the second detent of the trigger. The world outside her cockpit ceased to exist. For 0.8 seconds, the GAU-8 Avenger spoke, and its voice was the sound of tearing the sky in half. The entire airframe of the A-10 vibrated with a primal fury, a controlled earthquake that traveled from the cannon through the fuselage and up into the base of her spine. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burnt cordite, a scent more familiar to her than perfume. A torrent of 30mm depleted uranium shells, each the size of a milk bottle, erupted from the nose of her aircraft, a golden line of incandescent rage connecting her to the target. On the thermal display, the three white-hot figures on the ledge did not scatter. They did not have time. They and the rock they were standing on simply vanished in a blinding white flash of kinetic energy. The RPG threat was gone. Ares 1's frantic voice was still screaming in her headset, but it was already the voice of a man from the past, a man reacting to a reality that no longer existed. Evelyn ignored the dam. She ignored the voice. She banked the Warthog hard to the left, the G-forces mashing her into her seat, her eyes already hunting for the next target on the canyon floor. Colonel Thorne had called it a suicide run. He was wrong. This was not suicide. This was a reckoning. On the ground, the sound did not arrive as a gunshot. It was a physical blow, a brutal concussion of air that slammed into Chief Warrant Officer Mark Ares 1 Callahan and his men, pressing them flat against the cold rock. For a split second before the sound, he had seen the cliff face above them simply disintegrate. Rock Earth and the three enemy soldiers who had been seconds from executing them were vaporized in a flash of incandescent light, erased from existence. What in the hell was that? His radio man shouted, his voice tinny in Mark's earpiece. Mark didn't answer. He was looking up, his neck craned, searching the sliver of dark sky visible between the canyon walls. And then he saw it. A silhouette of pure, stubborn ugliness. Low, straight wings. Two engines mounted high on the tail. It was impossible. It was an A-10 Warthog, a relic flying inside the gorge, banking on a wingtip, with an agility that defied its reputation as a slow, lumbering beast. It was the aircraft from the radio, the one he had just been screaming at the pilot he had condemned as a fool. The pilot who had just saved their lives. All stations, Mark breathed into his comms, his voice now stripped of its earlier fury, left with only stunned awe. Hold your fire. That's friendly air. The words felt inadequate, absurd. The aircraft wasn't just friendly. It was a phantom, a ghost that had appeared from nowhere to tear a hole in their apocalypse. The perfect surgical plan that had been briefed to them was a catastrophic failure. Their intelligence was wrong, their infiltration compromised, their command structure blind. Everything had broken. And into that void, this impossible pilot had arrived. Hundreds of miles away, in the refrigerated quiet of the Combined Air Operations Center, Colonel Marcus Thorne watched the chaos unfold on a dozen different screens. The clean geometric lines of his battle plan had been replaced by grainy, chaotic video feeds and frantic overlapping radio calls. Trident's biometric sensors were flatlining. The drone feed was useless, showing nothing but the top of the canyon. His perfect network-centric operation had collapsed into a bloody primitive knife fight in the dark, and he was powerless to influence it. "Get me Valkyrie 1-1. He snapped his voice dangerously tight. An airman young enough to be his son flinched beside him. "Sir, she is not responding on any command frequency. We're tracking her transponder. She's well below the minimum safe altitude for this area." I can see that Airman Thorne seethed. She has deliberately severed communications and directly disobeyed a command to disengage. She is endangering a $20 million asset and threatening to expose our entire operation. His authority, so absolute in the briefing room, was now a useless frustration. He was a general watching his flawless toy soldiers being smashed by a child who refused to play by the rules. His system had failed, and the only person doing anything effective was the one person he had explicitly ordered to do nothing. The quiet major he'd dismissed as a relic was now the single author of this battle, and he was nothing more than a spectator to his own unraveling. In the cockpit, Evelyn Reed was immune to the chaos she was creating. The frantic calls from the ground, the apoplectic silence from command. It was all just noise outside the pure, focused world of her mission. While the systems of men failed her system, a symbiotic link between her eyes, her mind and her machine was working perfectly. Her thermal pod scanned the battlefield, painting a clear picture of the disaster. The ambush was larger and better coordinated than anyone had anticipated. The RPG team was just the bait. She saw the real threat now, the anchor of the enemy's position. On a parallel ridge tucked into a natural rock fortification, the intermittent flashes of heavy muzzle fire lit up her screen. A DSHK heavy machine gun, a .50 caliber monster, had the other half of Trident pinned down behind a miserable excuse for cover. The SEALs couldn't move, couldn't retreat, couldn't even raise their heads to fire back. Colonel Thorne's surgical strike from 25,000 feet could never have seen it. The drones would have missed it. It was a low-tech, brutal problem that could only be solved by a low-tech, brutal solution. Evelyn bypassed protocol entirely. There was no time for a 9-line targeting request. She switched her radio back to the SEAL's emergency frequency. Her voice was calm, devoid of emotion, a blade of pure information cutting through their panic. Ares 1. This is Valkyrie. You have a heavy machine gun nest on the ridgeline approximately 300 meters east of your current, suppressing your second element. I'm rolling in. It wasn't a request for permission. It was a statement of fact. Before Mark could even process the words, he saw the Warthog change its vector. It didn't climb out of the canyon. It dove deeper. This time the enemy was ready. The entire canyon erupted in a spider web of tracer fire, red and green lines of light arcing up from a dozen hidden positions, all converging on the lone dark shape of the A-10. The perfect plan was a fantasy. The command structure was a ghost. All that was left was a single pilot in an aging aircraft, flying directly into a storm of fire to save men she had never met. Everything had broken except for her. The sky in front of Evelyn's canopy became a lattice of incandescent death. Red and green tracers clawed at her, no longer a random web, but a concentrated storm of fire directed with lethal intent. From the ground, it looked like a suicide run, an aging aircraft offering itself up for slaughter. But inside the cockpit, Evelyn Reed was not thinking about survival. She was thinking about geometry. Every tracer was a line with an origin and a destination. Her job was to fly where the lines were not. The A-10 shuddered as smaller caliber rounds, the ones she couldn't see, hammered against its fuselage. The sound was not the sharp crack of a bullet, but the dull, percussive thump of a sledgehammer against an iron plate. The titanium bathtub around her was doing its job, but it was not invincible. The fundamental rule of combat aviation, drilled into every pilot from their first day of training, was that altitude is life. When under fire, you gain altitude and speed, creating distance and options. It was a rule written in the blood of thousands of pilots. Evelyn broke that rule. Instead of pulling back on the stick, she pushed it forward. The Warthog already dangerously low dove. On the ground, Mark Ares-1 Callahan watched in horror. The plane, which had been the sole focus of the enemy's rage, simply dropped below the lip of the canyon wall, vanishing from sight. The torrent of enemy fire, suddenly deprived of its target, raked aimlessly across the empty sky for a moment, before falling silent. "She's hit," one of his men yelled. "God damn it, she's down." A cold dread washed over Mark. He felt a surge of guilt so profound, it was nauseating. He had cursed her, questioned her, and she had flown into the heart of hell for them, only to be swatted from the sky. He had been so wrong, and now she had paid the price for his team's failure. But Evelyn was not down. She was executing a maneuver that did not exist in any modern flight manual. It was a technique taught in whispers by the old guard, the veterans of forgotten wars, a tactic born from the unique capabilities of her aircraft and the raw nerve of its pilot. It was a Ghost Rider canyon carve. The A-10 was now flying below the level of the enemy inside the narrowest, deepest part of the gorge, where a shallow river snaked through the rock. The roar of her engines, deafening in the open air, was now trapped between the canyon walls, an apocalyptic thunder that echoed off the stone. The plane's radar altimeter screamed a continuous piercing tone, a useless alarm in a situation where every inch of clearance was being judged by the human eye. The tips of her wings felt close enough to send sparks off the rock. The world became a gray-brown blur, a terrifying high-speed tunnel. This was not the calculated detached warfare of Colonel Thorne's drones and satellites. This was primal, visceral, an act of supreme confidence and controlled violence. She was not just flying an aircraft, she was wearing it. For 10 agonizing seconds, the sky was empty. The enemy, confused, began to redirect their fire towards the pinned-down SEALs. Then, precisely where the DSHK nest had its most exposed flank, the blunt, angry nose of the Warthog rose from the abyss. She did not climb, she erupted. The enemy gunners who had been firing across the canyon now found a predator in their back pocket, appearing from a direction they had thought impossible. Panic and confusion gave them a fatal moment of hesitation. It was all the time Evelyn needed. Her thumb selected a different weapon. This was a hard target, a fortified position that required more than the cannon's surgical precision. She needed overwhelming force. A ripple fire of 2 Hydra rocket pods sent a volley of 70mm rockets screaming across the short distance. They were unguided line-of-sight weapons, a throwback to an earlier era of air combat. And in her hands, they were devastatingly accurate. The rock fortification vanished in a series of rolling orange and black fireballs. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of the DSHK was replaced by the secondary explosions of the enemy's ammunition cooking off. The immediate threat to the second SEAL element was not just neutralized, it was annihilated. Evelyn did not admire her work. She banked hard, the G-forces immense, using her momentum to climb back to a safer, though still dangerously low altitude above the canyon rim. She began a slow, deliberate circle, her eyes once again scanning the thermal feed hunting. The master of the battlefield had reclaimed her perch. On the ground, the SEALs watched in stunned silence. They were not just witnessing an act of bravery. They were witnessing an act of artistry. The rage and confusion in Mark Callahan was gone, replaced by a cold, clear, and absolute respect. This pilot, this ghost, was operating on a level of skill and instinct he had never encountered. She was not just their air support. She was their commander now. She saw the whole board, and she was the only one who knew how to win. He keyed his radio, his voice steady, deferential. The question he asked was not a request. It was a concession. It was the transfer of command from the broken system on the ground to the lone warrior in the sky. "Valkyrie, what's your next target?" Mark Callahan's question. "Valkyrie." What's your next target traveled 700 miles in less than a second, an electromagnetic whisper that detonated with the force of a bomb in the sterile quiet of the command center. The airmen at their consoles froze their fingers hovering over keyboards. A two-star general observing from the command deck lowered his coffee cup with deliberate slowness. Colonel Marcus Thorne's face went from pale with stress to a deep, blotchy red. The carefully constructed hierarchy of the battlefield, the sacred chain of command, had just been publicly dismantled. A chief warrant officer of a Tier 1 Special Forces unit had just abdicated tactical control to a rogue major in a flying relic. It was a humiliation of unthinkable proportions. "Get that man on a private channel," Thorne barked at a communications tech. "Remind him who is in command of this operation. And you," he jabbed a finger at another officer, "I want Major Reed's service record on this screen. Now. I want to know who the hell she thinks she is." As the officers scrambled to obey, a quiet voice spoke from the corner of the room. "I can tell you who she is, Colonel." The voice belonged to a civilian contractor named Sam Styx Johnstone. He was a man in his late 60s with a permanent slouch and eyes that had seen too many sunrises over too many hostile deserts. He was a systems analyst now, but he had spent 30 years as a master sergeant in aircraft maintenance. He had forgotten more about the A-10 than most pilots had ever learned. While everyone else had been watching the screens with panic, Styx had been watching with a dawning, almost nostalgic recognition. He walked over to the main tactical display, pointing a weathered finger at the looping replay of Evelyn's canyon run. "The rest of you see a pilot breaking the rules. I see a pilot flying a perfect razorback descent. See that he traced her path. She didn't just drop, she followed the river's thermal contour. Kept her heat signature masked by the water until the last second. That's not in any manual they print today. That's old magic." Thorne glared at him. "What is your point, Mr. Johnstone?" "My point," Colonel Styx said, his voice level, "is that you don't have a rogue pilot on your hands. You have a Ghost Rider." The name meant nothing to Thorne or the younger officers. It was a ghost of a different kind. The Ghost Riders were the 33rd Tactical Support Squadron. Styx explained, his eyes distant. "Flew Warthogs in the last dirty war nobody wants to talk about anymore. They were tasked with everything nobody else would touch. Close support in impossible terrain, hunting insurgents in weather that grounded everyone else. They were unorthodox." An officer at a terminal looked up. "Sir, I have Major Reed's file." "Put it on the screen," Thorne commanded. Evelyn's service portrait appeared, a younger woman, her expression serious, almost grim. The file was a long, distinguished list of assignments, flight hours, and commendations. And there it was. Previous assignment, 33rd TSS Ghost Riders. Unit deactivated. Styx nodded slowly. They were deactivated because command couldn't control them. They valued lives on the ground more than they valued expensive airframes. Their unofficial motto was, "We go deep so they come home." They were the best canyon hunters and knife fighters in the sky the Air Force has ever seen, and we got rid of them because they were too risky for the modern zero-mistake military. He pointed to another line in her file, a dependent notation. "Reed Daniel P. Sargent, U.S. Army. Status KIA." Looks like she had a personal reason to believe in that motto. The room was silent. The puzzle of the rogue pilot was suddenly complete. Her impossible skill, her quiet defiance, her willingness to fly into the fire, it wasn't insubordination. It was her creed. Back in the thin, cold air above the Serafina Dam, Evelyn heard Ares 1's question. She felt the weight of it, the trust it implied. It was a burden she had been carrying alone for a very long time. She took a steadying breath, her mind already processing the next phase of the fight. Valkyrie copies. She transmitted her voice, a calm anchor in the storm. Next target is a mortar team setting up on the eastern overlook. They are preparing to fire on your position. I'm moving to engage. There was a pause on the line. Then Ares One's voice returned quieter, now respectful. Affirmative, Valkyrie. But I have to ask, who are you? Evelyn banked the A-10, lining up her run on the new threat. The question hung in the air, a query that went far beyond a name or a call sign. She thought of her brother, of the promise she had made, of the long, solitary years spent honoring it. She thought of the men on the ground, their lives now tethered to her own. Her thumb moved to the transmit button. Her reply was not for the history books or the official reports. It was for the men below and for the ghost in her cockpit. I'm just someone who knows the cost of leaving people behind, she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. Target marked. I'm rolling in. Her words broadcast for anyone on the net to hear still hung in the air, but Evelyn was already consumed by the deadly physics of her next attack. The act of flying and fighting was a refuge, a place of pure, uncluttered purpose, where the complexities of the human heart had no place. It was all angles, velocities, and trajectories. She pushed the stick forward, rolling the A-10 into a steep dive. The mortar position was on a high exposed cliff, a perfect perch from which to rain death down upon the trapped seals. Her targeting pod locked onto the heat signature of the mortar tube, and the three figures huddled around it. The heads-up display painted a simple, elegant solution onto her reality. A green box, a shrinking range counter, a firing solution indicator. Yet, as her body executed the mechanical perfection of the attack, Run, a cold, rational part of her mind, began to quietly catalog the cost. It was a voice she knew well, the voice of the professional officer, the survivor. It spoke without emotion, listing the consequences of her actions with the sterile precision of an after-action report. Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice: failure to obey a lawful order or regulation. Maximum punishment: dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, confinement for 2 years. The voice was calm. It did not accuse. It merely stated facts. Article 108. Willful or negligent loss, damage, or wrongful disposition of military property. The aircraft call sign Valkyrie 11 is valued at approximately $20 million. She had thrown away a 20-year career, her pension, her reputation, and her freedom in the span of less than 15 minutes. She had traded it all for men whose names she did not know on a piece of rock that would be forgotten by next week. The logic was indefensible. It was a catastrophic failure of professional judgment. But then another voice rose, warmer and more powerful, drowning out the cold accounting of the first. It was the memory of Daniel's laugh, a sound she hadn't realized she was starting to forget. It was the memory of hugging him goodbye before his final deployment, the feel of the rough, unfamiliar wool of his army uniform under her hands, the scent of dust and youthful optimism. He had felt so solid, so permanent. "Don't you worry about me, Ev," he had said, his grin confident. "I'm with good people down there. We look out for each other." Good people. That was the variable Colonel Thorne's equations had missed. To the system, the SEALs were a ground element. Her Warthog was an air asset. The battle was a series of risk-reward metrics. The modern military had become a bureaucracy of risk management, so terrified of losing a chess piece that it had forgotten the object of the game. They sought to manage war from a distance to render it clean and surgical. But war was not clean. It was a muddy, bloody, intimate affair, and its only meaningful currency was the lives of the people fighting it. Her sacrifice of career and freedom was not a failure of judgment. It was a protest. It was a rebellion against the cold math that would have left good men to die to protect a spreadsheet. The mortar team, alerted to her dive, fired a round. It was a desperate, unaimed shot, arcing wildly into the sky. But the explosion was close enough to pepper her aircraft with shrapnel. A piece of jagged metal, flung high and fast, struck the canopy directly in front of her face with a deafening crack. A spiderweb of fractures instantly bloomed across the armored glass, the lines converging at a single point. Right over the taped corner of Daniel's photograph. Evelyn didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady on the controls. The firing solution on her HUD turned from a box to a cross. The target was locked. She squeezed the trigger. A single 500-pound Mark 82 general-purpose bomb dropped from its pylon, a silent dark shape separating from the belly of her plane. It fell for 3 seconds that felt like an eternity, a pendulum swinging between life and death. The mortar crew saw it coming. They scattered. The bomb hit the cliff face, and the world below her dissolved into a roiling cloud of fire smoke and pulverized rock. The mortar position and the cliff it sat upon ceased to exist. Evelyn pulled back on the stick, the G-forces squeezing the air from her lungs. She climbed away from the fireball, the A-10 groaning in protest. As the adrenaline of the attack began to subside, a profound quiet settled in her mind. The cold voice of reason was gone. The emotional voice of memory was quiet. All that remained was a sense of clarity, of peace. She looked at the fractured canopy, at the web of broken lines overlaying her brother's smiling face. The crack did not obscure his eyes. She had always thought the struggle was between her duty as an officer and her promise as a sister, between logic and love. But looking at that fractured image, she finally understood. There had never been a conflict. There had never been a choice. There was only the promise. The rest was just noise. The fire from the destroyed mortar position dwindled to a dull, smoky orange against the encroaching dawn. For the first time since the ambush was sprung, a fragile, temporary silence fell over the Serafina Dam. It was the quiet of a predator catching its breath, and Evelyn knew it would not last. Valkyrie. This is Ares 1. Mark Callahan's voice came over the net, laced with a fatigue that went bone deep, but underpinned by a new, solid thread of resolve. All my elements are accounted for. We have wounded, but we're holding. The board is yours. What's the play? Stand by, Ares 1. Evelyn replied, her own voice a low, steady hum. Consolidate your position. I'm painting the picture. She eased the A-10 into a wide, high orbit, a circling hawk observing its territory. Below her, the thermal display showed the battlefield in stark shades of black and white. The seals were a tight cluster of brilliant white, the heat of living bodies fighting for survival. The enemy was a scattered constellation of cooler but still distinct signatures, and as she watched, she saw something that sent a chill down her spine. They were not retreating. They were not panicked. They were adapting. The sporadic, undisciplined fire that had characterized the first phase of the fight was gone. Now small teams of enemy fighters were moving with purpose, flanking, setting up new fields of fire, their movements economical and intelligent. They were no longer just trying to kill the seals. They were trying to solve the problem of her. The fire directed at her was no longer a panicked barrage, but probing, disciplined bursts, designed to gauge her reactions, to map her flight patterns, to force her into a predictable rhythm. Evelyn felt a strange, cold sense of connection to the unseen mind directing them. This was no mere insurgency leader. This was a tactician, a hunter who understood the three-dimensional chessboard of the canyon. He was using his own men as pawns, sacrificing them to learn her weaknesses. A grim, unspoken dialogue was taking place between them, a conversation written in tracer fire and evasive maneuvers. He knew she was the linchpin. Remove her, and the seals would fall. It had become a personal duel. Valkyrie. I've got a high-value target for you. A-10's voice crackled, cutting through her analysis. North side of the dam, moving on the access road. Looks like a BTR-80. It has to be their command vehicle. Evelyn immediately slewed her targeting pod to the coordinates. Sure enough, there it was. An 8-wheeled armored personnel carrier, its heat signature blooming on her screen. It was moving slowly, almost arrogantly, into a clearing. It was the perfect target. Too perfect. It's a trap, Valkyrie, one of the other SEALs transmitted. Has to be. It's a risk we need to take, A-10 countered, his voice tight with the dilemma. If we can decapitate their command, they'll break. The pressure was immense. Her entire purpose was to eliminate threats to the men on the ground, and they had just handed her the biggest threat of all on a silver platter. Every instinct of a close air support pilot screamed at her to roll in and kill it. But her Ghost Rider training whispered a different story. The old magic smelled a rat. Negative, A-10, hold your position. Something's not right, she said, her decision firm. She ignored the BTR, the juicy, obvious bait. Instead, she began a slow, methodical scan of the cliffs and rock formations surrounding the clearing. The enemy commander was trying to force her hand to make her fly a predictable straight-line attack run. He wanted her to focus on the pawn so she wouldn't see the bishop waiting in the shadows. The crosshairs of her TGP crept across the landscape meter by agonizing meter. Valkyrie, what are you waiting for? It's sitting wide open, A-10 pressed, the tension evident in his voice. Patience, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Her gaze was fixed on the screen. She passed over a dark shadow near the top of a cliff, a cave mouth or a deep recess. Nothing. She was about to move on when a flicker of instinct made her pause. She cranked the thermal gain on her display, pushing the sensor to its limits. The image became grainy, but the contrast sharpened. And there it was. Faint, but unmistakable. The dual parallel lines of 2 long barrels and the boxy shape of a gunner's shield, almost perfectly cold-soaked to match the temperature of the surrounding rock. A ZU-23-2. A twin-barreled 23mm anti-aircraft cannon. A notorious shredder of low-flying aircraft. Son of a bitch, she whispered. The BTR was the cheese. The ZU-23 was the steel jaw of the trap, positioned to obliterate her the moment she committed to her attack. The enemy commander was smart, but he thought she was just a pilot. A plan audacious and incredibly risky formed in her mind. A-10, she said, her voice now hard as steel, broadcasting on the open net for her adversary to hear. You are right. The target is too valuable. I'm engaging the BTR. She rolled the Warthog into a steep, aggressive dive, a classic attack profile pointing her nose directly at the armored vehicle. The enemy commander would be watching his gunner's hands, tightening on his controls, waiting for her to enter the sweet spot of his kill zone. But as the A-10 screamed towards the earth, her thumb selected not the cannon, but an AGM-65 Maverick missile. The video feed from the missile's own seeker head appeared on one of her displays. She had a clear lock on the BTR. Then she did something that went against every doctrine. Just before she fired, with a flick of her thumb on the coolie hat switch, she broke the missile's lock on the BTR. For a split second, the seeker was untargeted. She fired. The Maverick dropped from the pylon, its rocket motor igniting with a brilliant flash. It was a dumb shot, flying blind, but in the second after launch, as the missile accelerated, she slewed her TGP's crosshairs from the BTR to the hidden ZU-23. A green box snapped around the faint heat signature. She commanded the missile's seeker, now in flight, to lock onto the new target designated by her pod. On the ground, they would only see the missile leap from her wing, seemingly streaking towards the BTR. But in the invisible world of data links and sensor-fused weapons, the Maverick, a silent hunter with a mind of its own, began a slight, deadly curve. Its trajectory was no longer aimed at the bait. It was aimed at the heart of the trap. Time seemed to stretch and distort. For the men on the ground, the missile was a fiery spear hurtling towards the obvious threat. For the enemy anti-aircraft crew hidden in their rocky alcove, it was a distant, irrelevant event, a prelude to their own imminent triumph. Only Evelyn, her universe compressed into the green glow of her multifunction display, saw the truth. She watched the missile's seeker, a tiny digital brain, obey her final command. The crosshairs, once locked on the BTR, now held steady on the faint thermal ghost of the ZU-23. The missile, a creature of pure logic, adjusted its flight path with a minute correction of its control surfaces, an almost imperceptible curve. It was the deadliest sleight of hand in the world. She was already pulling the A-10 out of its dive, the G-forces a familiar crushing weight, when the missile arrived. The explosion was not where anyone expected. It did not blossom from the BTR on the valley floor. It erupted 100 meters higher, a violent volcanic burst from a cliff face that was supposed to be empty shadow. The shockwave ripped through the canyon, and a secondary detonation, brighter and more powerful, lit up the dawn as the ZU-23's ammunition cooked off, turning the hidden alcove into a miniature sun. The BTR, the commander's bait, sat untouched and suddenly irrelevant, a steel tombstone marking the grave of a failed plan. The psychological impact on the enemy force was immediate and catastrophic. For the past hour, they had been fighting against a ghost, an unseen force that anticipated their every move. But their commander had laid a perfect trap. The hidden cannon was their ace, the physical manifestation of their superior cunning. Its violent, impossible destruction was not just a tactical loss, it was a psychological shattering. On Evelyn's thermal display, the change was dramatic. The disciplined constellations of enemy soldiers dissolved. Order devolved into chaos. The deliberate probing fire ceased, replaced by panicked individual flight. It was the digital signature of a rout. She had not just destroyed a weapon system, she had broken their will to fight. A voice thick with disbelief and reverence crackled in her ear. "Jesus Christ, Valkyrie, how did you—" It was Ares 1, his question trailing off, unable to form the words to describe what he had just witnessed. He and his men had seen the bait, felt the tension, and were now staring at the smoldering ruin of a trap they never even knew existed. They were not just being saved anymore. They were being given a masterclass in the art of war by a pilot who saw a different reality than they did. Evelyn watched the enemy scatter below, and she felt something new. For 20 years, her war had been a private, solitary penance. Each flight, each mission was a quiet act of remembrance, a defensive shield she held up to honor the memory of her brother. It was about preventing another loss, about holding the line, about being the guardian angel he had asked her to be. But as she watched the enemy commander's strategy unravel, as she saw his forces break and run from a blow they never saw coming, the feeling was not one of relief. It was a cold, sharp, and unfamiliar sense of triumph. It was the thrill of the hunter who has outwitted her prey. The weight of her grief, for the first time in a long time, was eclipsed by the fierce, clean pride of a warrior. This was not defense. This was dominance. A new perspective settled over her, as clear and sharp as the view through her HUD. The promise to Daniel was not just about saving people from the fire. It was about putting the fire out. She had been given an incredible weapon, a lifetime of skill, and a battlefield where she held every advantage. Just saving the SEALs wasn't enough. It wasn't victory. It was just delayed defeat. The lonely guardian, the quiet relic. The woman who knew the cost of leaving people behind, made a decision. Her internal battle was over. Now it was time to end the external one. Her voice when she keyed the radio was different. The calm professionalism was still there, but it was now imbued with an undeniable edge of command. It was the voice of someone who was no longer reacting, but leading. Ares. 1. The enemy is in a full rout. They're disorganized and running blind. We are no longer on the defensive. We are now the hunters. A beat of silence from the ground. I want your team to advance on the dam's primary turbine hall. Their command structure is shattered. Press the advantage. I will clear your path. We are taking the objective. We are finishing this. Acknowledge. It was not a suggestion. It was an order. An order given by a major in the Air Force to a chief warrant officer in the Navy SEALs, an order that ripped up the rulebook and rewrote the mission from scratch. The objective was no longer survival. It was victory. Mark Callahan crouched behind a rock, looked at the burning cliffside, then at his men who were staring up at the sky. He keyed his mic, his response simple, immediate, and absolute. Solid copy, Valkyrie. We're moving. The hunt began. On the ground, the advance was swift and brutal. Led by Ares 1, the SEALs moved with a renewed predatory purpose. The desperate defensive scramble from cover to cover was gone, replaced by the disciplined violence of a unit on the attack. They flowed over the terrain, leapfrogging between positions, their movements orchestrated by the dark angel circling above them. It was one of the younger SEALs thought like walking in the shadow of God's own avenging sword. Every time a pocket of resistance appeared, it was silenced from above, before it could become a threat. A burst of machine gun fire from a maintenance shed was answered by a short, terrifying roar from the A-10's cannon that shredded the building's metal walls. A technical vehicle trying to escape was vaporized by a single rocket. Evelyn's work was not just supportive, it was prescient. She saw the threats before they materialized, clearing a path for the men below with ruthless efficiency. I've never seen anything like it. The young SEAL breathed over their internal comms channel. An older, more senior operator replied, his voice raspy. My old man was in the first Gulf War. Used to tell stories about the A-10s. Said they were the only things that flew low enough to see the look in your eyes. Called them the ground pounder's best friend. This is different, another SEAL chimed in. This isn't just a pilot. This is a ghost. It's like she knows what the enemy is going to do before they do. Back in the command center, the atmosphere had undergone its own dramatic shift. The frantic anger had evaporated, replaced by a tense, stunned silence. Every officer in the room was watching the main tactical display, transfixed. The chaos of the failed ambush had been replaced by a clean, coherent image, a blue, friendly icon, trident steadily advancing, preceded by the sweeping circular flight path of a single green aircraft icon, Valkyrie. They were witnessing the complete reversal of a military catastrophe orchestrated by the one person they had all dismissed. Colonel Thorne sat rigid in his chair, his face a pale mask. He was a spectator at his own court-martial. The textbook plans, the network-centric doctrines, the risk mitigation strategies all had been rendered meaningless. He was watching a masterclass in a form of warfare he had deemed obsolete, and it was being conducted by the very officer he had publicly belittled. The two-star general who had been observing quietly turned to Styx Johnstone. Tell me more about this Ghost Rider unit, Mr. Johnstone. Styx took a slow sip of his cold coffee. There isn't much to tell that's in the official records, General, he said, his eyes never leaving the screen. They were legends to the guys on the ground and nightmares to the brass. I remember a time in the Korangal Valley. A Marine recon team got cornered, cut off by a blizzard that grounded the helicopters and the fast movers. Command wrote them off, said the weather made extraction impossible, an unacceptable risk. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. 2 Ghost Riders who were already in the air heard the call. They went in anyway. Flew for 4 hours under the cloud ceiling in a snowstorm through a valley they called the Mouth of Hell. They used up every bullet and rocket they had, providing cover until a window opened for a single chopper to get in and out. They landed back at base with nothing but fumes in the tanks and holes in the wings. Command tried to bring them up on charges. The Marines they saved had a different opinion. The unspoken parallel was a palpable force in the room. This was not a fluke. It was a legacy. The new relationship between the sky and the ground had become a seamless, deadly symbiosis. Their radio communications were stripped of all formality, honed to a fine edge of pure function. Valkyrie, I have 2 hostiles in the 3rd-story window of the administration building, eastern face, Ares 1 reported. Copy, Ares 1. That window is coming out, Evelyn replied. The deep brrr-t of the cannon echoed through the canyon for 2 seconds. Ares 1, the window is out. Your path is clear. Solid copy, moving. As the SEALs finally reached the heavily reinforced steel doors of the main turbine hall, their original, now achievable objective, a brief lull, fell. They took cover, preparing for the final breach. In the relative quiet, Ares 1 keyed his mic. His voice was different now. It was quiet, stripped of tactical urgency. It was the voice of one human being speaking to another. Valkyrie, my point man's name is Diaz. This is his last deployment before he retires. He's got 3 kids in San Diego. He paused. Just thought you should know. It was not a report. It was a confession, an acknowledgement, a profound offering of trust. He was telling her that the lives she was fighting for were not icons on a screen. They were real. He was sharing the weight of his command with her, the sacred burden of knowing the names and the stories of the men whose lives were in his hands. In the cockpit, surrounded by the green glow of her instruments, Evelyn heard his words. She did not reply. She did not need to. Her gaze flickered to the cracked canopy, to the smiling face of the young man in the photograph. The fight had always been for him. Now it was for Diaz, too. The abstract had become personal. The transformation was complete. With a deafening breach charge, the steel doors to the turbine hall blew inwards. The SEALs flowed through the opening like water, a disciplined flood of black-clad operators disappearing into the cavernous industrial darkness of the dam's interior. The fight, which had been a sprawling, 3-dimensional battle across the canyon, now contracted into the claustrophobic confines of concrete and steel. For Evelyn, the change was instantaneous and unnerving. Her tactical overview, her god's-eye view of the battlefield, vanished. The men she had guided and protected were now just a collection of friendly biometric icons on her map moving through a structure she could no longer see inside. She could offer support on the building's exterior, suppress windows, and deny reinforcements, but she was now blind to their immediate fight. The perfect symbiotic link between air and ground was partially severed. A familiar cold feeling of helplessness began to creep into the edges of her focus. She was forced to rely on their voices, on the strained, breathless reports coming over the radio to build a picture of the battle in her mind. Contact catwalk, 2nd level, suppressing. Diaz is hit! I need a corpsman! The calls were a staccato rhythm of controlled chaos. Then Ares 1's voice cut through tight, with a new, deadly urgency. Valkyrie, we have a problem. They're heavily fortified in the main control room. It overlooks the entire generator floor. We're pinned down on the central catwalk. We can't advance, can't retreat. We are caught in the fatal funnel. The words struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. Pinned down. Can't move. The hum of her engines faded away, replaced by the ghost static of a transmission from 2 decades ago. The cool green glow of her cockpit dissolved into the harsh, sun-bleached glare over a dusty, forgotten mountain range. She was 24 years old again, her knuckles white on the controls of an older A-10. Below her, a platoon of Army Rangers was trapped on an exposed ridge, a position they had nicknamed the Anvil. And on the radio, a voice young and cracking with the terror of his first real firefight was calling for her. Her brother's voice. Valkyrie Actual. This is Ranger 26, Bravo. We're pinned down up here, taking heavy RPG fire from the caves. We can't move, I say again. We are pinned down. She had pushed the nose of her Warthog over, ready to dive, ready to bring the righteous fury of her cannon down upon the enemy. But another voice her flight commanders had cut in cold and absolute. Valkyrie 1-1, you stand fast. That valley is a confirmed manpads threat. Command has not authorized kinetic engagement in that sector. Your orders are to observe and report. Do not engage. Acknowledge. Sir, they are being cut to pieces down there. She had pleaded, her voice tight with desperation. Acknowledge the order, Major. She had obeyed. It was the great defining failure of her life. For 7 eternal minutes, she had been forced to fly a high, impotent orbit, a helpless spectator, to the slaughter of her brother's unit. She had listened to the frantic calls for help, the screams, the rising crescendo of the firefight, and then the final dreadful silence, all while following a lawful order. The secret she carried was not just his death, but her own complicity in it, a wound that had never healed. The memory ended as it always did, with that soul-crushing silence. She snapped back to the present. Her reflection stared back from the HUD, her face a mask of stone. But behind her eyes, a storm of pain, guilt, and 20 years of suppressed rage was gathering. The silence in her memory was about to be answered by a deafening emotional explosion in the here and now. She would not let it happen again. There were no more commanders to obey. There was only the promise. Her voice when she spoke was terrifyingly calm, a layer of ice over a volcanic core. Ares 1, what is the composition of the wall of that control room? The question was so unexpected, it took him a moment to answer. Reinforced concrete. At least 2 feet thick, standard for a structure like this. Why? Get a man with a laser designator to put a spot on the center of that wall. Then get your men as far away from it as you can. Tell them to get behind the turbines. Now. Valkyrie, what are you? You can't penetrate that with a strafe. It's impossible. Do it, she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. Ares 1 gave the order. A tiny, coherent red dot of light appeared on the exterior of the massive concrete wall of the turbine hall. Evelyn swung the A-10 around in a tight, vicious arc, lining up her attack run. This was not for a bomb or a missile. This was a job for the Avenger. She was going to use a cannon designed to kill tanks to perform a feat of impossible surgery. She brought the plane in low and fast, the roar of its engines a rising scream of intent. She was not just attacking a building. She was attacking the past. She was attacking the memory of her own failure. Her thumb depressed the trigger. The GAU-8 spoke, and its voice was a cathartic roar of fury held in for 2 decades. A focused 2-second burst of 30mm PGU-14B armor-piercing incendiary round shells made of depleted uranium slammed into the concrete wall, not as an explosion, but as a focused drill. The rounds didn't just hit the wall. They punched through it, superheating the concrete, turning it into molten shrapnel and continued on a stream of incandescent metal that tore through the control room inside, obliterating everything and everyone in its path. From the outside, it was a precise, unbelievable act of destruction. But for Evelyn, it was the sound of a ghost finally being laid to rest. Inside the turbine hall, the air was thick with the dust of pulverized concrete and the smell of ozone. The SEALs, shrouded in the gloom, stood for a moment in stunned silence, their flashlights trained on the smoldering, perfectly round hole in the thick interior wall. Through it, they could see the wreckage of the control room, a scene of absolute devastation. It was a wound created by a ghost, a testament to an impossible feat of flying and firepower. "Holy," Diaz whispered, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. Ares 1 broke the spell. "Forget the wall. Plant the charges," he commanded, his voice shaking off the awe. "Let's finish this mission." His men moved with swift purpose, attaching the explosive packages to the massive turbine generators that were the dam's heart. Victory was within their grasp, a reality snatched from the jaws of certain defeat. But just as the final charge was being set, a new sound filled the hall, a deep, grinding groan of tortured metal, followed by a series of heavy sequential thuds that vibrated through the floor. Simultaneously, klaxons began to blare, and rows of red lights flashed on a nearby control panel. Their demolitions experts swore, tapping furiously at the dead console. "Sir, they've triggered a full, uncontrolled spillway release. All 11 gates are opening. The controls in here are fried. They're going to flood the entire downstream valley." It was the final spiteful act of a defeated enemy. A scorched earth tantrum designed to kill thousands of civilians, a final spasm of terror from a commander who had been outmaneuvered at every turn. Ares 1's voice was urgent as he keyed the radio. "Valkyrie, the enemy has opened the spillways. It's an uncontrolled flood event. We can't stop it from in here. You have to destroy the primary hydraulic manifold block. It's on the exterior of the dam, top-level eastern side." In the cockpit, Evelyn processed the request. The emotional catharsis of her last attack run had faded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. The ghost of her brother was finally quiet, but in its place was a vast, silent emptiness. She had poured out 20 years of grief and rage, and now there was nothing left but the quiet hum of the engines and the blinking of low fuel and low ammunition warnings. Her plane was wounded, the canopy fractured, the airframe riddled with holes. She was running on fumes, both literally and spiritually. She looked at the tactical display. The manifold was a small, hardened target located in a position that offered no cover, no tactical approach. It would require a slow, steady, head-on attack run. It was a suicide mission designed for a fresh pilot in a pristine jet, not for a ghost in a dying machine. This was the final bill for her defiance, the price for saving the men on the ground. She could refuse. She could claim her aircraft was too damaged, her fuel too low. No one would blame her. She had already done the impossible. But the promise had not been to do the impossible. The promise had been to bring them home. The job wasn't finished. She keyed her mic, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Solid copy, Ares 1. I'm on it." She banked the battered Warthog, turning it back towards the dam for one last pass. As she lined up her run, she saw it. A final flicker of heat from a rocky outcrop near her target. A last manpads team held in reserve for precisely this moment. The enemy commander, even in defeat, had laid one last trap. There was no room to outsmart this one. No trickery, no Ghost Rider maneuver could save her now. The only way to the target was straight through them. She had outsmarted their commander, she thought, with a grim sense of irony, but there was no outsmarting a missile. She pushed the throttle to its stop, coaxing every last ounce of power from her damaged engines. The plane vibrated, a wounded animal being spurred into a final charge. The missile launched a fiery streak against the morning sky, screaming towards her. Her fingers danced over the console, deploying the last of her countermeasures. Chaff and flares erupted behind her, a desperate glittering cloud. She broke hard to the right, forcing the missile to bleed energy in a tight turn. It was a textbook defensive maneuver executed perfectly. But the missile was too close, its seeker too good. It didn't hit her directly. The proximity fuse detonated 10 meters from her right engine. The explosion felt like the hand of God swatting her from the sky. The A-10 was thrown into a violent, uncontrolled roll. A fire warning light screamed on her panel, and the right engine sputtered, choked on shrapnel, and died. Alarms blared in a deafening chorus. The plane was mortally wounded, but it was still flying. With sheer brutal strength, Evelyn fought the controls, wrestling the crippled aircraft back to a level flight path. She was flying a brick, a lopsided fire-trailing wreck, but her nose was still pointed at the target. Through the smoke, the fire, and the fractured glass, she held the hydraulic manifold in her sights. Her thumb pressed down on the trigger. The Avenger, with its last 30 rounds, spoke one final defiant time. The depleted uranium shells tore into the manifold, and the complex machinery of steel pipes and pistons exploded in a shower of sparks and hydraulic fluid. Below, the massive spillway gates, halfway open, groaned, shuddered, and froze in place. The flood was stopped. Evelyn had just enough airspeed to clear the dam. The battle was over. The objective was secure, but her plane was dying. She pulled back on the stick, but there was no response. The fire in her right engine had consumed the hydraulic lines. She keyed her radio for the last time. Her voice was strained with the effort of holding the plane steady, but it was eerily, unnaturally calm. Ares 1. The manifold is destroyed. The objective is secure. She took a ragged breath. Valkyrie is going down. The final seconds of flight were a brutal, intimate wrestling match with a dying beast. Evelyn fought the controls with every ounce of her remaining strength, her vision tunneling her arms, screaming in protest. The A-10 did not want to fly. It wanted to fall. But she would not let it. She managed to keep the nose up, the one remaining engine sputtering as she aimed for a relatively flat, rocky mesa a few miles beyond the dam. There was no grace in the landing. It was a controlled crash, a violent, grinding arrival. The aircraft slammed into the earth belly first, the sound of shrieking, tearing metal absolute and all-consuming. It skidded for 200 meters, shedding parts and carving a deep, ugly scar in the terrain, before finally lurching to a halt in a cloud of dust and leaking hydraulic fluid. And then silence. A silence more profound and deafening than the cannon's roar. Pain bloomed in her left shoulder, hot and sharp, dislocated. She ignored it. With her good arm, she methodically unstrapped herself, killed the master power, and pushed the heavy canopy open. The morning air, cool and smelling of sagebrush and hot metal, washed over her. She had survived. She was reaching for the survival pack when a new sound intruded. The familiar rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter rotors approaching fast. Her first instinct was hostile. She drew her sidearm. But as the helicopter, a Black Hawk, flared for a landing 50 meters away, she saw the markings of the 160th soar. The ramp dropped before the skids even touched the ground. The first man out was not a pararescueman. It was Ares 1, still in his combat gear, his face grim. He and 2 of his SEALs ran towards the wreckage of her plane. "We are not leaving you behind," Major Mark Callahan said, his voice leaving no room for debate. It was the simplest, most profound statement of loyalty she had ever heard. The flight back to Al Tariq Air Base was conducted in a state of near silence. The SEALs helped her into the helicopter, their movements gentle, almost reverent. They sat with their helmets off, the adrenaline of the battle draining away, leaving them quiet and watchful. They didn't thank her. They didn't need to. They just watched her, the quiet woman who had descended from the sky and rewritten their fate. The unspoken truth was a tangible presence in the cramped cabin. She was one of them now. When the Black Hawk touched down on the main tarmac, the scene that greeted them was unnerving. The normal chaotic symphony of the flight line, the whine of turbines, the shouts of ground crew, the rumble of fuel trucks had fallen quiet. As Evelyn limped down the ramp, flanked by the SEALs, the work stopped. One by one, mechanics straightened up from engine cowlings. Airmen pushing munitions carts paused. Pilots conducting their own pre-flights stopped and turned. They did not cheer. They did not salute. They simply watched. A sea of faces, young old officers enlisted, stared in a heavy universal silence of profound respect. The story of the lone Warthog, the rogue major, and the impossible victory had clearly traveled faster than the helicopter. Near a hangar, Lieutenants Raptor Mitchell and Viper Ross stood frozen, their earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by expressions of pure awe. As Evelyn passed, Raptor met her gaze. He was the picture of the modern hotshot pilot she was supposed to be obsolete in the face of. But he saw her now not as a relic, but as a master of a craft he was only beginning to understand. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that was simultaneously an apology, a salute, and an admission of utter respect. Evelyn, her face a bruised mask of exhaustion, gave a barely perceptible nod in return, and continued walking. Her path took her directly past the command building. Colonel Marcus Thorne was standing on the steps. His arms crossed his face, a storm of conflicting emotions. He was the system she had defied, the authority she had rendered irrelevant. He opened his mouth, ready to unleash the torrent of fury and procedure that was his only remaining weapon. But the words died in his throat. He saw the silent, watchful eyes of every person on his flight line fixed on her. He saw the quiet, protective cordon of the Navy SEALs walking with her. He saw the truth standing right in front of him, written not in regulations, but in action. He had lost. There was nothing to say. His silence was the final unconditional surrender of his world to hers. Evelyn walked past him without a glance, her steady, limping pace never faltering. Her silent retreat was complete. She didn't need a medal, a parade, or a speech. The quiet, solemn respect of the men and women she had sworn to serve alongside was the only commendation that ever mattered. She disappeared into the bright, sterile entrance of the base clinic alone once more, leaving a legend behind her on the tarmac. 2 days later, Evelyn sat on the edge of her cot in the quiet of her Spartan room. Her left arm was bound securely in a sling, a dull, throbbing ache, a constant reminder of the price of her victory. The base beyond her window had returned to its normal rhythm, the sounds of jets and machinery, a familiar backdrop to a world that had already moved on. Her room was just as it had been before, impersonal, transient, a place for a soldier to rest between battles. But it was not the same. She was not the same. On the small nightstand, her worn wooden box sat open. Next to the faded photograph of Daniel and the threadbare patch of the Ghost Riders, a new object rested. It was a simple, circular patch, its black fabric embroidered with the golden trident and anchor of the Navy SEALs. Someone had left it on the table outside her door at the clinic, while she slept, a silent, anonymous token of gratitude. The two patches sat side by side. One represented a promise made in grief and youth. The other a debt acknowledged in fire and respect. A closed circle. A hesitant knock came at her door. She opened it, to find Lieutenant Jake Raptor Mitchell standing in the hallway, his usual swagger replaced by a profound and awkward humility. He held his flight helmet in his hands, turning it over and over as if he didn't know what to do with it. Major, he began, his eyes not quite meeting hers. We, the other pilots, we've been looking at the gun camera footage from the mission. He faltered, searching for the right words. The canyon run, that first pass. It's not in any flight manual. It's not in any simulator. We can't figure out how you did it, how you knew to fly like that. It was his way of asking for forgiveness, his way of admitting how wrong he and the world he represented had been about her. Evelyn's gaze drifted from the young pilot's face to the 2 patches on her nightstand. The answer he wanted wasn't about aerodynamics or G-forces. It was about something older, something the manuals could never teach. The Air Force gives you a book of rules for a reason, Lieutenant. She said, her voice quiet, without accusation. Most days following those rules is what keeps you alive. They're written in the blood of people who learned the hard way. Your job is to know that book backwards and forwards. She paused, letting him absorb the words. But your duty, she continued, finally meeting his eyes, is to know the one day when following the book is going to get someone else killed. The hard part isn't learning how to fly. It's learning to recognize that day when it comes. Raptor stood speechless for a long moment, the simple, profound truth of her words settling over him. He finally seemed to understand that she operated on a different moral calculus, one forged in a crucible he had never had to face. He gave a single sharp nod of understanding. Thank you, Major. He turned and walked away, no longer just a pilot, but a student. Evelyn closed the door, the silence of her room enveloping her once more. The battle was over. The adrenaline was gone. The catharsis had passed. Now all that remained was the quiet reality of the aftermath. Her career was over. She knew that with absolute certainty. There would be a board of inquiry. Colonel Thorne would ensure the book was thrown at her, his own failures buried under the weight of her insubordination. She had traded her future for their lives. She picked up the photograph of Daniel, her thumb gently tracing the edge of his smiling face, now safe behind the fractured glass of her memory. She had finally answered the crushing silence of his death with the righteous thunder of her actions. The promise was kept. But as she looked at his youthful, untroubled eyes, the final lingering question settled in her heart, a fragment of the battle that would remain with her forever. She had defied her orders and her oath to a system to uphold a promise made to a ghost. She had saved 16 men, and in doing so had perhaps saved a part of her own soul. But was it an act of ultimate loyalty or ultimate betrayal? What is the true nature of duty? Is it a soldier's unwavering obedience to the chain of command? Or is it found in the silent, solitary, and often brutal calculus of a promise that simply must be kept no matter the cost? The answer did not reside in the sky or in the roar of a cannon, but in the quiet, unbreakable space between 2 patches resting side by side in a small wooden box. In the end, Evelyn Reed is left alone in the quiet, with only the silence and the weight of her choices for company. Her story isn't one of grand parades or public glory. It is a testament to a deeper, more personal form of honor, the kind that is earned in solitude and paid for with immense sacrifice. Her journey through that canyon forces us to ask ourselves a difficult question. What is the true measure of duty? Is it found in perfect adherence to the rules or in the courage to break them when a human life hangs in the balance? Her story is a powerful reminder that the most profound acts of heroism are often performed not for a flag or a medal, but for a promise made to a memory, for the faces of the people you have sworn to protect. Our world is full of these quiet professionals, these unsung heroes who make impossible choices in moments that are never recorded in the official histories. They are the bedrock of our society, the guardians who stand the watch, while the rest of us sleep their integrity, their only witness. These are the stories we seek to tell. We search for the echoes of courage in forgotten histories and overlooked lives, believing that in understanding their choices, we can better understand our own. If you too find meaning in these explorations of character duty and the complex calculus of a promise, we invite you to subscribe. Join us on this journey, and together we will continue to honor the legacies of the heroes who walk in silence. Thank you for listening.